So coming to the heart wall is made up of three layers, as explained some time back. The endocardium, the inner lining, the myocardium, and the epicardium, which is surrounded by a double membrane sac called as pericardium with the pericardial cushioning fluid in between. So the innermost layer of the heart is the endocardium. It is made up of the lining of simple squamous epithelium and covers the heart chambers and the valves, simple squamous epithelium. It is continuous with the endothelium of the veins and the arteries of the heart. This is very important. It is continuous with the endothelium of the vessels of the heart, supplying the heart inside, and is joined to the myocardium by a thin layer of connective tissue. The endocardium, by secreting endothelins, may also play a role in regulating the contraction of the myocardium. So, not only from the SA node, which relays the electrical conduction to cause the heart contraction, but from the endocardium, endothelins which are secreted also may be playing a role in the cardiac contraction. The middle layer of the heart is the myocardium, which is the cardiac muscle, a layer of involuntary striated tissue surrounded by a framework of collagen. So the cardiac muscle pattern is elegant and complex as the muscle cells swell and spiral around the chambers of the heart. They are intertwined. So, as such, with the outer muscles forming a figure of eight pattern, interwoven around the atria and around the bases of the great vessels and the inner muscles, forming a figure eight around the two ventricles and proceeding towards the apex. This is how the heart is structured for its functioning. The complex swirling pattern allows the heart to pump blood more efficiently. So this is God's doing, so that the work is done comprehensively. So the two types of cells in the cardiac muscles. One is the muscle cell. So muscle cells which have the ability to contract effectively and easily, and the pacemaker cells of the conducting system, which we saw some time back. The contractile cells are connected by interciliated discs which allow the rapid responses to impulses of action potential from the pacemaker cells. The intercalated discs allow the cells to act as a syncline and enable the contractions that pump blood through the heart and into the major arteries. The pacemaker cells make up only about 1% of the cells and form a conduction system of the heart. They are generally much smaller than contractile cells and have a few myofibrils, which gives them limited contractibility. So basically only for conduction, not for much contraction. So the function is similar to the many aspect to neurons. That is why electrical conduction, like neurons here in the heart. So the cardiac muscle tissue has autorhythmicity, the unique ability to initiate cardiac action potential at a fixed rate, spreading the impulse rapidly from cell to cell to trigger the contraction of the entire heart. So it's a wonderful thing, the heart. They've got intrinsic ability to start conducting and spreading it in such a manner that it goes to all the cells and then enables the contraction. The specific proteins expressed in the cardiac muscles, there are a lot of proteins expressed in the cardiac muscles. These are mostly associated with muscular contraction and bind with actin, myosin, tropomyosin, and troponin. These proteins include MYH6, ACTC1, TNN13, CDH2, PKP2. Other proteins expressed are MYH7 and LDB3 that are also expressed in the skeletal muscles. That these last two, MYH7 and LDB3, are also found in the skeletal muscles, which are voluntary muscles, whereas cardiac muscles are an involuntary one. The pericardial sac that surrounds the heart, the outer surface of the pericardium is called the fibrous membrane. It is lined by a double layer inner membrane called the serous membrane that produces the pericardial fluid to lubricate the surface of the heart. The part of the serous membrane is attached to the fibrous membrane is called the parietal pericardium, the part attaching the two layers. Which, while the part of the serous membrane attached to the heart is known as the visceral pericardium because it is inside. Viscera is always inside. The pericardium is present in order to lubricate the movement against other structures within the chest. So in the heart there is no compression or anything. To lubricate, the heart is able to adjust and move and pump. And to keep the heart's position stabilized within the chest and to protect the heart from infection. One thing very important, pericardium. The coronary circulation. So when we are coming to the coronary circulation, heart tissue, like all the cells in the body, needs to be supplied with oxygen, nutrients, and a way of it has to have a way of removing metabolic waste. This is achieved by the coronary circulation, which includes arteries, veins, and lymphatic vessels. Blood flow through the coronary vessels occurs in peaks and troughs relating to the heart muscles relaxation or contraction. Heart tissue receives blood from two arteries that arise just above the aortic valve, which we saw before. These are the left main coronary artery and the right coronary artery. Left main coronary, right coronary artery. The left main coronary artery splits shortly after leaving the aorta into two vessels. On the left side of the heart, its left main coronary artery splits into two after leaving the aorta. And the left anterior descending artery is the main artery supplying the whole front portion of the heart. This is what I was telling about, the widow's artery, the left and main LAD, left anterior descending artery. And the left circumflex artery. Circumflex, it goes around the heart, left circumflex artery. The left anterior descending artery supplies the heart tissue and the front, outer side and the septum of the left ventricle. That is why when you see in the ECGs, you will know when V2, V1 is usually T wave is inverted. V2, V3, V4, it indicates an anteroseptal infarct. If V5, V6 are involved, it is the anterolateral. So ECG interpretation is also based on the anatomy of the heart. So the left circumflex supplies the back and the underneath of the left ventricle. The right coronary artery supplies the right atrium, right ventricle and the lower sections of the left ventricle. The lower sections from the right side, coming from the right side. The right coronary artery also supplies blood to the AV node. This is important in about 90% of the people. And the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node and the SA node. In SA node in about 60% of the people. The right coronary artery runs in a groove at the back of the heart. It goes behind right coronary artery, on the side, behind, in a groove. In this thing, and there is significant variation in people in the anatomy of the arteries that supply the heart. Arteries divide at the furthest reaches into smaller branches that join together at the edges of each arterial distribution. That is, they divide into a lot of branches, the arterioles, and then join together. That is why after an attack, when some people are able to, with exercise, not much of strain, revascularization is possible. Through the infarcted area, other vessels can supply. But that doesn't mean that you can wait for an attack, leave it, and then carry on thinking that revascularization will occur. Because once the cardiac muscle tissue is dead, that becomes a fibrous tissue, just like that contracting with the rest of the heart. Then the coronary sinus is a large vein that drains into the right atrium, receives most of the venous drainage of the heart. It receives blood from the great cardiac vein. The great cardiac vein, if you see, it is draining at the bottom of the left and right ventricles, the great cardiac vein, and the small cardiac veins, both these together. The posterior cardiac vein draining from the back of the left ventricle. So the posterior cardiac vein from the back of the left ventricle, the middle cardiac vein from the bottom and the left of the right ventricles, and the small cardiac veins, and the anterior cardiac veins that drain from the front of the right ventricles directly into the right atrium, whereas the other posterior cardiac vein, the middle cardiac vein and the small cardiac veins drain into the great cardiac vein, receiving, that is draining into the bottom of the left and right ventricles, the middle cardiac vein. So, when you come to the lymphatic networks called plexuses, exist beneath each of the three layers of the heart. So, underneath all the three layers of the heart are the lymphatic system. These networks collect into a main left and right main trunk, which travel up the groove between the ventricles. Between the two ventricles, it goes up the groove. Then these vessels travel into the atrioventricular groove and receives a third vessel, which drains a section of the left ventricle sitting on the diaphragm. Left ventricle sitting on the diaphragm, that portion of the lymphatic this thing, it receives that. And then ending in the inferior tracheobronchial node. So the tracheobronchial node is the end, this thing of the lymphatic drainage from the heart. The right vessel travels along the right atrium from the left side. The right vessels travel along the right atrium and the right part of the right ventricle sitting on the diaphragm, and then usually travels in front of the ascending aorta and ends in the brachiocephalic node. And the nerve supply to the heart. So the heart receives its nerve signals from the vagus nerves. Very important, vagus nerve. That's why sometimes we say don't massage the heart too much. Pulling the tie, it stimulates the vagus nerve. The heart rate can suddenly lower, and then the patient can have a dizzy attack, vasovagal attack. So the vagus, this thing is very important. The vagus nerve is a wandering nerve that emerges from the brain stem and provides the parasympathetic stimulation to a large number of organs in the thorax and the abdomen, including the heart. The nerves from the sympathetic trunk emerge through the T1 to T4 thoracic ganglia and travel to both the sinoatrial and atrioventricular nodes. So the basic nerve supply, conduction supply of the SA node is through the sympathetic trunk, which emerges from the T1 to T4 vertebra, coming down from the brain to the SA node and the AV node, as well as to the atria and the ventricles. The ventricles are more richly innervated by sympathetic fibers rather than parasympathetic fibers. So, the sympathetic supply is more for the ventricles than the parasympathetic supply from the vagal nerve. So the sympathetic stimulation causes release of neurotransmitter norepinephrine, that is noradrenaline, at the neuromuscular junction of the cardiac nerves. This shortens the repolarization periods, thus speeding up the depolarization and contraction, which result in an increased heart rate. So the sympathetic stimulation increases the heart rate. The parasympathetic stimulation of a vagal nerve can decrease the heart rate, causing a sinoatrial attack or vasovagal syncope, etc. So it opens up the chemical or ligand-gated sodium and calcium ion channels, thus allowing the influx of positively charged ions. Norepinephrine binds to the beta-1 receptors. So this is the basic anatomy, nerve supply and this thing. So when we come to the physiology of the heart, we have seen about the contraction and everything. The heart functions as a pump in the circulatory system and provides a continuous flow of blood throughout the body. The circulation consists of sympathetic circulation to and from the body and the pulmonary circulation to and from the lungs. We have seen. That is the oxygenated blood returning back, the deoxygenated blood going back, and from the left ventricle, the oxygenated blood being circulated to all the organs of the body. The systemic circulation then transports oxygen to the body and returns carbon dioxide and relatively deoxygenated blood to the heart for transfer to the lungs to get oxygenated again. The right heart collects the deoxygenated blood from two large veins, the superior and inferior vena cava. Blood collects in the right and left atrium continuously. The superior vena cava from the upper portion of the body, head and neck, drains blood from above the diaphragm and empties into the upper back part of the right atrium. The inferior vena cava drains blood from below the diaphragm, abdomen, wherever, and empties into the back portion of the atrium below the opening of the superior, just below the opening of the superior vena cava, deoxygenated blood. Immediately above and to the middle of the opening of the inferior vena cava is the opening of the thin-walled coronary sinus. So that's why we spoke about it. Just below the opening of the superior vena cava is the coronary circulation, sinus, blood from the deoxygenated blood from the heart reaches there. Additionally, the coronary sinus returns deoxygenated blood from the myocardium to the right atrium also. It also returns deoxygenated blood directly to the right atrium. Blood collects in the right atrium. When the right atrium contracts, blood is pumped through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Naturally, right atrium contracts to the right ventricle contracts into the pulmonary system. The right ventricle contracts, when the right ventricle contracts, this valve, tricuspid valve closes so that there is no backflow, and this goes into the pumped into the pulmonary trunk through the pulmonary valve, which then closes like a ballooning effect. It doesn't have papillary muscles. Pulmonary and aortic valves don't have the papillary muscles to pull it shut. The pressure of the blood itself from above closes it. And then progressively smaller arteries through the lungs until it reaches the capillaries. All these parts by alveoli, carbon dioxide is exchanged for oxygen. This happens through the passive process of diffusion, oxygen carbon dioxide exchanged in the lungs. In the left heart, oxygenated blood is returned to the left atrium. So, in the left side of the heart, oxygenated blood comes to the left atrium. And via the pulmonary veins drain into the left atrium, then it reaches the left ventricle through the mitral valve. And once this atrial contraction through the mitral valve into the left atrium, then the mitral valve closes. When the left ventricle contracts, the mitral valve is closed. There is no going back. By the papillary muscles, this is pushed out, pumped out into the aortic trunk for systemic circulation, and the aortic valve closes by the pressure. It doesn't have the papillary muscle action. So the atria and the ventricles work in concert. So in systole, when the ventricles are contracting, the atria are relaxed, collecting blood. So atria finishes work, then the ventricles contract. This is closed. When the ventricles contract, atria relaxes and collects blood again. The ventricles relax, atria pumps back into the ventricle. That is how the system works. So atria contract to pump blood into the ventricles. This coordination ensures blood is pumped effectively to the body. At the beginning of the cardiac cycles, the ventricles are relaxing. When you start the cardiac cycle ECG, ventricles are relaxed. As they do so, they are filled in by blood passing open through the mitral and tricuspid valves, to the mitral to the left and tricuspid valves to the right. After the ventricles have completed most of their filling, the atria contract, forcing further blood into the ventricles and priming the pump. Fully, when they are roasting, it pumps. Once again it does, fully drains, further exerting pressure with the aortic and pulmonary arteries. The aorta and pulmonary valves start opening. So then the blood ejected from the heart causes the pressure within the ventricles to fall. Blood is ejected through the ventricles, the pressure in the ventricles starts falling and causing the pressure within the ventricles. Simultaneously, the atria refill as the blood flows into the right atrium through the superior and inferior vena cava and into the left atrium from the pulmonary veins. Finally, when the pressure within the ventricles falls below the pressure within the aorta, less than the aortic pressure, it falls. Then the aortic and pulmonary valves close. The ventricles start to relax and the mitral and tricuspid valve opens, and again the flow into the ventricles through these valves from the right and left atria. The cycle begins again. So the cardiac output is the measurement of the amount of blood pumped by each ventricle, which is the stroke volume in a minute. This is calculated by multiplying the stroke volume in the beats per minute of the heart rate, so that cardiac output is systolic volume SV into the heart rate. Cardiac output is normalized to body size through the body surface area called as cardiac index. The average cardiac output using an average stroke volume average is around 70 ml. That is around 5.25 liters per minute the heart pumps, with a normal range of 6 to 8 liters per minute. The stroke volume is normally measured using an echocardiogram. Echo shows the stroke volume or the ejection fraction and can be influenced by the size of the heart, the physical and mental condition of the individual, sex, contractibility, duration of contraction, preload and afterload. That is, you'll see in various diseases, disorders, failure of the heart and all that, the cardiac volume differs and changes. Preload refers to the filling pressure of the atria at the end of diastole. Diastole, the heart is fully relaxed, the ventricles. So the pressure